Lucas Mason didn't move out to the edge of Jefferson County to be liked, and he sure as hell didn't move there to be bothered. When he bought the old Sadler property just past the tree line near the gravel mill, the only thing he wanted was distance. Distance from noise, from questions, from the steady decay of city politeness that wore a man down without him even noticing. He was in his early 60s, hands weathered from years of mechanical work, the kind of man who preferred fixing a broken fuel pump in silence over making small talk in grocery store lines. The Sadler place was run down when he signed the deed, fence posts leaning like drunks, dirt driveway swallowed up in weeds, and the barn out back looked like it was mid-sentence before a storm shut it up for good. But Lucas saw something in it that others didn't. Boundaries, space, silence thick enough to feel like protection. He didn't need much, just land he could walk without seeing anyone, and a house where no one could knock on the door unless they really meant it. He spent the first few months fixing things the way old men fix things. Not fast, but permanently. Replaced all the wiring in the kitchen, had a new well pump installed, cleared the drainage ditch by hand with a trenching hoe. The coop behind the barn had potential, so he ordered chicks from a local breeder, Rhode Island Reds, good for eggs and hardy in the cold. With them came something else. Predators. Raccoons first, bold and relentless, slipping through gaps in the old mesh. Then coyotes. One morning he came out and found feathers, just feathers, and blood smeared against the chicken wire like someone had tried to paint a message in the dark. He patched up the coop, reinforced it with plywood and sheet metal, but after the second coyote kill he'd had enough. That's when he installed the electric fence. It wasn't ornamental. Lucas didn't put in decorative posts or cute little "Beware of the Dog" signs. He ran heavy-duty wire around the full perimeter of his property, almost 2 acres, and connected it to a livestock-grade energizer, buried the power line, installed a battery backup, and locked the control box behind a steel latch. The current wasn't lethal, but it would stop any animal or idiot trying to squeeze through his hedges. He made sure to follow code, printed out the regulations himself, laminated them, and kept them in a folder above the fuse box. Every 15 feet he nailed a yellow warning placard to the fence. Electric fence. High voltage, do not touch. He thought that would be the end of it. And for a while, it was. The chickens were safe, and the nights were quiet again. That is, until Karen. He first noticed her the second week of August, around the time the heat gets mean and the ground cracks like old leather. Lucas was loading lumber out of his truck when he heard a voice that didn't match the tone of the woods or the rustle of wind. High-pitched, clipped, with that drawl that only happens when someone thinks they own the world one comment at a time. That's not very neighborly, you know. Lucas turned. There she was, standing just beyond his fence on the far east side, arms crossed over a tie-dye shirt stretched a little too tight across a body that looked like it resented every bit of movement. Short, blonde, thick around the neck and hips, with a posture that screamed she wasn't just a neighbor, she was a self-appointed authority figure. Karen. He didn't need to ask her name. Every community had one. She was the kind of woman who walked her dog without a leash, started sentences with, "I just think it's interesting," and treated property lines as suggestions unless they benefited her. Lucas hadn't introduced himself when he moved in, and that alone probably offended her more than anything else he could have done. He didn't answer right away. He pulled out the last 204, shut the truck bed, and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Excuse me," he said, not hostile, just flat. "The fence," she said, waving her hand like it was a swarm of bees instead of wire. "Electric. Honestly, I think it's a bit extreme. What if someone touches it by accident? What if a child wanders up and gets hurt?" Lucas looked around. There were no children for half a mile. No footpaths, no schools, no parks. Just road, brush, and pine. And Karen. "It's marked," he replied, "all the way around." Karen gave a little laugh like he'd made a joke and she was politely pretending to get it. "Still, it feels aggressive. It gives off a certain energy. People are going to talk." "Let 'em." Lucas turned back toward the house. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Over the next week, he caught glimpses of her more and more often, at the property line with a hose, watering a patch of grass that looked like it hadn't grown since Carter was in office, pretending to pick up something just beyond the fence, like she'd dropped it 100 times before. Once, standing dead still with a pair of binoculars, not even pretending to look at birds. Lucas didn't wave, didn't say a word, just made sure the battery on the fence stayed charged and the system was armed. He didn't like confrontations. He liked systems that worked, rules that were followed, and problems that stayed solved. But Karen didn't believe in any of that. To her, rules were tools. If she didn't like the outcome, she'd twist the rule until it bent into something she could use as a lever. And Lucas, silent, private, unbothered, was the kind of presence that agitated people like her. His quiet made her louder. His distance made her lean in. The chickens were laying well. The fence was holding. And yet, one Sunday morning, just after sunrise, Lucas stepped out onto the porch with his coffee and saw something that made him pause mid-sip. Karen was standing near the northeast corner of his property, wearing an oversized pink bathrobe and Crocs, holding a long metal rake in both hands like it was a lance. She looked straight at him, grinned like she was about to win a game he didn't know they were playing, and jabbed the rake forward. It hit the fence with a dry snap, then a sharp pop, followed by a sizzle that sent a burst of sparks up the shaft. Karen screamed, a short, guttural sound more rage than pain, and stumbled backward, dropping the rake and landing hard on her side in the dirt. Lucas didn't move for a second, just watched. The rake was still twitching where it lay. Then he set the coffee down, calmly walked back inside, and called emergency services. He didn't panic, didn't yell, didn't even feel that usual surge of adrenaline, because somewhere in the back of his mind, even if he hadn't said it out loud, he knew this was going to happen. She'd tested every inch of his boundary short of violence, and now the fence had done what it was built to do. When the ambulance arrived, she was already sitting up, red-faced and wheezing like someone had taken her pride and wrung it out in the dirt. The EMTs asked what happened. Lucas didn't lie. He showed them the warning signs, pointed out the breaker box, handed them the documentation. Everything was legal, safe, and within regulation. Karen didn't want to go to the hospital, but she made a scene, one that didn't end when the ambulance left, because that was just the start. Lucas had reinforced his land with volts and wire. Karen, now burned in ego if not body, was about to start reinforcing hers with something far harder to fight: spite. And Lucas knew then. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Lucas didn't hear from Karen the next day, nor the day after that. For a man like him, silence was rarely suspicious. It was earned. But this quiet didn't feel earned. It felt loaded, like the kind that builds behind a thunderhead when the temperature drops and the air thickens. He didn't trust it, and as he went about his day, feeding the chickens, checking the fence charge, clearing a few storm-felled branches by the drainage ditch, he found himself watching the tree line more than usual. It wasn't paranoia, exactly. It was the kind of alertness a man develops after enough years of being proven right by trouble. You start listening not for noise, but for its absence. And Lucas heard nothing. No dog barking on her porch, no rustling from her side of the fence, no muttered comments tossed his way. Just quiet. Cold. Deliberate. Quiet. On the third day, as he returned from town with a trunk full of feed and fencing staples, he noticed something off. The eastern edge of his property, where the land dipped slightly before the forest reclaimed it, was oddly rutted. The grass had been trampled in a pattern too erratic for deer and too precise for a wind-blown branch. Lucas parked the truck, stepped out, and followed the tracks. They ran along the fence for about 20 yards, then stopped. Just stopped. No exit path, no return trail. Like whoever had walked there disappeared. And then he saw it. A shallow indentation near the base of one fence post, freshly disturbed earth, but no footprints around it, just the compressed impression of something having knelt there. He crouched, swept the dirt with his glove, and found a scorched patch the size of a coffee can lid, like someone had tried to ground out the fence with a wire or tool. A loose screw sat beside it, the kind you'd find on a battery terminal. He stood slowly, the skin between his shoulder blades tightening. Someone had been here, not just walking, tinkering, testing. Karen. Probably, but she hadn't come back alone, not with that limp of hers. Lucas didn't see any tire tracks, though. No vehicle. Whoever helped her came on foot, and whoever they were careful. That night, he set up one of the trail cams he used during deer season. Nothing fancy, just infrared, motion-activated, and silent. He didn't broadcast it or sync it to a phone, just let it record to its internal card and staked it low behind the tall grass near the fence. He didn't want it spotted. 2 mornings later, the card was full. Lucas sat in the workshop with his coffee, watching the playback on an old laptop. First few clips were standard: possums, raccoons, a curious skunk. Then, just after 3 a.m., 2 figures appeared, hooded, moving low. One held a flashlight with red cellophane over the lens. The other carried what looked like a pry bar and some kind of hard-shell case. They approached the same fence post Lucas had checked, the one with the scorched ground. The flashlight beam played across the wires, then the energizer box off to the side. The second figure knelt and opened the case. Inside was a voltmeter. Lucas could see the screen flash as they connected it to the fence. They weren't vandals. They were testing the system, logging something. The footage ended before they left, motion dying off before they retreated. Lucas watched it twice, then closed the laptop. His pulse didn't quicken, his hands didn't shake, but a heaviness settled in his chest. This wasn't a prank, this was a probe, and probes had follow-ups. By noon that day, he was down at Wilson's Farm and Supply asking about motion sensor floodlights and no trespass signage with metal posts. The clerk, Sammy, a kid barely old enough to drink, asked if he was having critter problems. Lucas looked him in the eye and said flatly, "Not yet." Later that afternoon, a white SUV parked at the end of his driveway. He didn't recognize the vehicle, but he recognized the woman who stepped out. Karen, dressed this time in a tight-fitting blue blouse and jeans that did their best to pretend her body hadn't just bounced off a fence. Her left arm hung stiff and her expression was molded into something between pained dignity and practiced offense. She didn't walk up the driveway. She stood by the mailbox like she was holding court. Lucas approached, not in a rush, but directly. He stopped 5 feet from her, boots crunching gravel. "You here to apologize?" he asked. There wasn't any sarcasm in it, just weariness. Karen narrowed her eyes. "I'm here to make something clear. You assaulted me, whether you like it or not." Lucas didn't answer. She continued. "I've spoken to some people, lawyers. You think because you slapped a few warning signs on that barbaric fence you're protected. Let me tell you something. There are ways around everything, and you've got yourself a serious liability out here." Lucas waited, watching her the way you watch a rattlesnake you're not quite sure is dead. Karen stepped closer, her voice lowering. "I could own this place. You know that? You could be back living out of your truck, tinkering with chicken wire and drinking instant coffee in the dark while someone else guts this house and sells the parts." Lucas exhaled once, slow and even, then said, "You done?" Karen sneered. "You're gonna wish I was." She got back in the SUV. He watched as it turned slowly and crawled down the road, dust lifting behind it in lazy spirals. That evening, Lucas filed a report with the sheriff's department. Not a complaint, just a statement. He brought in a printout of the stills from the trail cam, labeled the timestamps, and filled out the form with the patience of a man who knew exactly how bureaucracy worked. He didn't demand patrols. He didn't wave papers. He just documented. Built his file. Brick by brick. The deputy at the front desk, a woman named Fallon, glanced over the images and asked if he'd considered installing perimeter lights. "Already in the truck," Lucas said. "You want me to add her name to the report?" "Not yet." Back home, he bolted the workshop, double-checked the energizer, and scanned the fence line by flashlight. Everything held. But he knew, deep in his bones, that pressure was building. Because when people like Karen feel humiliated, they don't come back with fists. They come back with paperwork, with rumors, with others who owe them favors. They fight in silence and committees. They turn your calm into doubt. And Lucas was no fool. He hadn't built a life alone just to watch it get chipped away by someone who didn't understand what boundaries meant. He made himself a stiff drink, turned off the porch light, and sat in the dark, listening. Something was coming. And he was ready. The first sign that things had shifted from passive threats to deliberate harassment came not with fire, glass, or fists, but with a subtle rearrangement of the ordinary. It was just after 6 a.m. when Lucas stepped outside with his coffee and noticed that his trash bin had been moved. Not knocked over, not rummaged through by raccoons, just moved. Not even far, maybe 3 feet from where he'd left it, closer to the road, half tilted like someone had rolled it and changed their mind mid-motion. A small thing, easy to ignore, but Lucas didn't ignore small things. Small things, out of place, meant hands had been where they didn't belong. He checked his cameras. Nothing. The trail cam had captured deer, an early fox, and then a black frame. Motion registered at 2:47 a.m., but the lens was fogged over. Lucas walked out to inspect the post. A fingerprint, smudged, oily, left just below the edge where the plastic casing clipped. It could have been an accident. It could have been deliberate. That's the problem with men who've lived alone long enough. They learn that doubt is just a slower kind of damage. By noon, a second sign arrived. An envelope, unmarked, slid halfway into his mailbox. Not mailed, not stamped. Inside, a single photograph. Printed on matte paper, grainy but recent. It showed his fence, taken from outside the eastern tree line. A wide-angle shot, low to the ground, like from a trail cam or crouched position. In the foreground, a hammer. Wooden-handled, slightly rusted, head down, pointed at the fence. No message, just the photo. A suggestion. Lucas didn't call the sheriff this time. Not yet. He took the photo, scanned it into his computer, then placed it in the same folder where he was collecting the rest. Screenshots, motion data, a diagram of the fence circuit, a copy of the state electric perimeter statutes. No declarations. No accusations. Just proof. If the day came, he'd rather have too much than too little. But it wasn't over. That same afternoon, he drove into town for kerosene and birdseed, left the property unattended for less than 2 hours. When he returned, the front gate latch had been twisted open. Not broken, not forced, just undone and hooked back into place wrong. The catch loop bent slightly, like someone had practiced opening it quietly. Inside, nothing missing. No footprints. But near the well pump, in the dirt where he usually parked his mower, were boot tracks. Deep, wide, and recent. That night, Lucas sat in the workshop with the blueprint of his property unfolded across the workbench. He marked the tracks with red pen, the camera angles with green, and the blind spots, his true vulnerabilities, with black. He didn't panic. He fortified. 2 more trail cams. One in the cedar at the back of the chicken run, the other strapped to a corner post facing the east tree line. He changed the batteries, tested the motion sensitivity, and set them to record in night vision mode. He wasn't waiting for another visit to tell him he'd been watched. He was going to watch back. The next 3 nights were quiet, uneventful. The footage showed rustling brush, the wind shaking tree limbs, and on one occasion a coyote skirting the fence. Lucas checked the wiring, inspected every insulator. all held. It wasn't until the fourth morning that something new happened. Something stupid and bold and deliberate. A black Ford Ranger, old model, pulled up just past sunrise. Lucas was on the porch with his second cup of coffee, already dressed for work. Carhartt vest, steel toes, gloves tucked into his belt. The driver didn't step out immediately. Just idled, engine knocking faintly, door creaking as it opened. A man climbed out. Not young, but not old. Balding, stocky, with the same slouch Karen had in her voice, entitlement built from repetition, not earned through struggle. He didn't introduce himself. He stepped up to the fence, stared at Lucas, and said, "So, this is the asshole who thinks voltage makes him a man." Lucas didn't rise. He let the silence settle for a beat, then said, "Can I help you?" The man spat. "You can get the hell out of here before you hurt someone else." Lucas took a sip of coffee. "You're on private land. Last warning." "I'm Karen's son," the man said, puffing his chest slightly, "and my mother doesn't need to be scared of her own damn neighbor." Lucas didn't flinch. "Your mother isn't scared. She's angry. There's a difference." The man stepped forward, hand to the gate latch. "I'm not playing games." Lucas stood now. Not fast, not threatening, just firm. He set the coffee down, walked to the steps. "Back away from the gate." The man hesitated, glanced down at the latch, fingers twitching like he wanted to finish what he started, but something about Lucas made him pause. Maybe it was the posture. Maybe it was the calm. Or maybe it was the double barrel that Lucas had leaned, not aggressively but visibly, against the porch column. "You think you're tough," the man muttered, "hiding behind wires and guns." Lucas stared. "I'm not hiding. I'm home. And if I see you here again without a badge or a warrant, I won't be standing on the porch when we talk." The man left. No apology. No backing down. Just a retreat that pretended it was tactical. The truck spun gravel and Lucas watched until it vanished around the bend. That night the chicken coop was hit. Not destroyed, not even broken into. Just disturbed. The wire latch undone, the feed scattered, one hen with a twisted wing and blood on its beak, like it had fought something. The gate hadn't been forced. It had been opened. Lucas checked the cams. Nothing. Whoever came had used the western tree line. Blind spot. Just out of reach. The next morning, he drove to the sheriff's office with the full file. Spoke to Deputy Fallon again. Calm, measured. This time he gave them names. He described the son. Provided the plate number. Filed a formal report for trespassing and animal harassment. Fallon nodded, took the paperwork and said she'd speak to them. But Lucas knew better. Warnings don't stop people like that. Warnings just make them quieter. And Karen? Karen didn't show herself again. But her lawn ornaments changed. On the side of her property that faced his, she'd erected a new display. Plastic flamingos, 10 of them, all positioned in a line facing his fence like some ridiculous army. Behind them, a handmade sign. Voltage doesn't fix cowardice. Lucas didn't answer with signs. He answered with locks, with metal reinforcements on every latch, with a new backup battery, and with a deep, silent understanding that this wasn't about fences or chickens anymore. This was about control, about claiming space, drawing lines, and seeing who would flinch first. Lucas wasn't flinching. Not now. Not ever. It had been over a week since Karen's son tried his little show at the gate, and the tension hadn't broken. It had simply calcified, settling into the air like a second skin. Lucas went about his days with the same routine, but there was a slight shift to everything now. He walked a little slower when circling the fence line, listened longer at night before locking up, and made note of every strange sound, every subtle shift in how the trees moved or the gravel settled beneath his boots. This wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition, hardwired into men who'd lived long enough to know most fights don't start with fists. They start with silence, and Lucas was hearing too much of it. The mail was the first formal shift. One envelope, this time with a return address, a legal firm from 3 counties over. Not a name he recognized, but the paper was crisp, thick, expensive. Inside, a cease and desist letter, language dressed in legal neutrality but with clause underneath. It accused Lucas of maintaining a hazardous perimeter, of intentionally escalating a neighborhood dispute through intimidation tactics, and warned that continued aggressive behavior may result in civil action. It was signed by a lawyer on behalf of a concerned local party, though Lucas didn't need the name spelled out. He read the letter twice, then filed it in the same manila folder as everything else. But the letter wasn't the midpoint. It was the spark. The midpoint came 3 days later, when a white city vehicle rolled down his gravel road and stopped just past the first post. A man stepped out, early 40s, khakis too clean, clipboard under his arm, that government posture. Polite, but already bored. He introduced himself as David Glenn, code enforcement. He didn't smile. Lucas invited him through the gate, not out of warmth, out of control. He wasn't going to give anyone the satisfaction of suggesting he had something to hide. They walked the perimeter. Glenn pointed to the signs, the wiring, the Energizer box. "Well maintained," he said, writing something. "But we've had a formal complaint. Says the fence exceeds residential safety thresholds." Lucas handed him a copy of the state guideline printout. Highlighted, annotated, approved voltage ranges. Signed certification from the supplier. Glenn skimmed it, nodded. "Looks good." They checked the Energizer box. Glenn used his own multimeter. The reading came back within range. He squatted, tapped the grounding rod with his boot, and stood. No issue here. Lucas didn't thank him, just waited. "But," Glenn added, almost as an afterthought, "the complaint also included concern about noise levels. There's a claim the Energizer hums at night." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "It doesn't." "I figured," Glenn said. "Still, I've got to document. It's minor. Consider this an informal check-in." Lucas nodded once. Glenn left shortly after, polite and neutral to the end. But Lucas knew what that visit meant. Karen hadn't just pushed for a legal angle. She was trying to get the county involved, trying to pile pressure on his neck through bureaucracy. She didn't want to win a fight. She wanted to bury him under procedural gravel, force him to flail against papers and policies until he slipped up. That night, Lucas poured himself a drink and sat in the workshop with the paperwork spread across his bench. The code enforcement document, the legal letter, his own diagram of property lines. He had done everything right, every step, but doing things right wasn't always the same as being left alone. Not when someone else was hell-bent on pulling you into their mess. By morning, something had shifted. Not around the property. Inside Lucas. He drove back into town, visited the assessor's office, and paid for a fresh certified survey of his property. Not because his old one was invalid, but because he knew Karen would twist even the idea of a boundary into something she could challenge. He hired a local surveyor with a good reputation and a bad attitude, someone who didn't like being lied to and didn't like being used. He explained the situation. The man raised an eyebrow and said, "Yeah, I've heard about her." Lucas also stopped by a small law office just off the main square. Inside was a sharp, fast-talking woman named Megan Hart. She wasn't some big-name litigator, but she had a spine like rebar and asked all the right questions before Lucas even finished the back half of his story. She agreed to take the case as a preemptive consult. No motion yet, but they'd be ready to counter if things moved. "You did the smart thing," she told him. "Most folks wait until they're bleeding before they reach for a lawyer." Lucas liked her already. 2 days later, the surveyor arrived. They walked the full 2 acres together. Measured twice, recorded meticulously. Every marker, every edge. It matched Lucas's original files to the inch. The land was his, legally and absolutely. No encroachments, no missteps. But just before they finished, the surveyor paused, squinted toward the east tree line, and said, "That new mulch path through the trees, yours?" Lucas turned. A thin stretch of fresh wood chips barely visible between the brush, snaking outward into the woods beyond his lot. He hadn't put it there. It wasn't wide, not obvious, but it was a path, worn enough to matter. Someone had been trespassing regularly enough to leave a trail, and now they were trying to cover their tracks. Lucas didn't speak. He simply memorized the angle, the depth, the way the branches had been cleared. That night, he walked it with a flashlight and his .38 tucked behind his belt. No animals, no traps. But 30 yards in, he found a single wooden stake in the ground, thin and painted orange. It wasn't his, it wasn't old. It was a marker. For what? He didn't know. But someone had plans. And Karen didn't fight alone. Lucas didn't dig it up. He left it, placed a cam high in the pines, above sightline, and angled it at the trail. If they came back, he'd know. He returned to the house, locked every door, and wrote down everything in a notebook. No dates, no frills, just facts. Because now it wasn't just about his fence or his birds. Someone wanted his land, and Lucas had no intention of giving it to them. The warning signs didn't come as shouts or threats this time. They came in whispers that Lucas wasn't meant to hear. A week after the survey confirmed his property lines down to the inch, he was in town picking up wire fasteners when he overheard two men at the hardware counter talking in low voices. One mentioned the guy out by the ridge with the electric fence, and the other chuckled, said something about how he's got them all spooked, especially her. Lucas didn't flinch, didn't interrupt, but something about the tone, the casual familiarity, the unspoken "Gee," told him that his story had grown legs. Karen was talking. Not filing, not fighting, just spreading stories like oil in water. Slow, invasive, hard to clean up. It wasn't the content that bothered him. It was the method. Lucas had learned a long time ago that some people don't try to beat you. They try to corrode your place in a community until you're either hated or isolated. And once you're alone, they move in, piece by piece, until what you built stops looking like yours at all. Karen wasn't out for revenge anymore. She was out for erasure. It escalated in layers. First came the noise complaints. 2 in 1 week, filed anonymously but obviously coming from the same source. Lucas got the county's copy in the mail, vague claims about mechanical humming and disturbing electrical pulses late at night. Lucas checked his system. Nothing irregular. He even shut it down overnight for 2 days straight just to prove a point, and sure enough, the third night brought another complaint. This time, it wasn't even subtle. Potential EM interference with cardiac devices in the vicinity, the form said, in language so awkward it sounded like someone had copied it from a medical blog. Then came the wildlife calls. Twice, animal control showed up to his gate, asking if he'd seen injured deer or displaced coyotes near the property. Both times he answered honestly. No, he hadn't. Yes, his fence was well within regulation. And no, he hadn't baited, trapped, or fired on anything he wasn't legally permitted to. The second officer, a younger guy with tired eyes, gave him a long look before admitting offhand, "We don't really think it's about animals, sir. We've just got to follow up when someone calls it in." Lucas thanked him, but didn't smile. It didn't stop there. One evening, just after dusk, he found a red bandana tied around the latch of his chicken coop. No footprints, no forced entry. Just the fabric knotted tight and stained at the corners. A signal, maybe, or a test. Lucas took it down without a word, burned it in a metal bucket out by the shed, and reset every camera angle across the property. He also installed new locking hinges on the coop, reinforced the feed bins, and added motion-activated floodlights facing the grove. He wasn't paranoid. He was just done giving chances. The most aggressive push came later that week, when two men showed up claiming to be part of a local land acquisition group. They wore matching polo shirts, clipboards tucked under their arms, and they had the kind of smiles that slid off the face the moment they stopped talking. They called it a courtesy visit, said they were working on behalf of a development firm interested in consolidating natural parcels for a conservation initiative. Lucas listened, silent, hands tucked behind his back. They offered to discuss compensation packages, hinted at zoning adjustments in the future, and casually dropped that they'd already spoken to neighboring landowners who expressed interest in collaboration. Lucas asked for their cards. They handed him one each. Names printed in that corporate sans serif font that made every firm look the same. When they finished their pitch, Lucas said only this: "You step foot past that gate again, I'll assume you're trespassing, and my response will be appropriate." The men left quickly, their politeness unraveling at the edges. The taller one mumbled something about attitude, but Lucas didn't follow them down the drive. He waited until they were gone, then called Megan Hart, his lawyer. They met the next day in town. He brought the cards. She recognized the firm. They were tied to 2 pending lawsuits over eminent domain manipulation in the next county. Megan's expression darkened. "They're not just sniffing," she said. "They're circling. Someone's feeding them info, maybe even inviting them in." Lucas didn't say it out loud, but he didn't have to. They both knew who that someone was. Karen hadn't needed to prove anything in court. She'd just opened the door for others who knew how to dismantle a man's world without ever picking up a tool. That night, Lucas walked the perimeter of his land, slower than usual. The air was thick with heat, the kind that held on to every smell: pine, old oil, something faintly metallic. When he reached the corner near the old storm drain, he stopped. A hole, freshly dug, no more than a foot deep, sat 3 feet from the fence post. Not wide enough to trip over, not deep enough to be obvious, but deliberate. Clean cuts through the soil, and a single object inside: a rusted wrench, half buried, angled toward the house. Lucas stared at it for a long time, then covered it back up with dirt, pressing the soil flat beneath his boot. Some signals weren't worth dignifying. 3 days later, he was pulled over on the way to town. The officer was polite but firm, said he'd gotten an anonymous report about Lucas's truck weaving erratically near the mill road. Lucas had driven that road 10 minutes earlier without a single turn. His truck was old but solid. Nothing wrong with his brakes. The stop ended without incident, but the message was clear. He was being watched, not just on his property, but wherever he went. Lucas called Megan again. This time, they drafted a preemptive restraining order request. Karen hadn't trespassed recently, but her pattern of provocation and indirect harassment, documented through reports, was enough to begin the process. Megan warned him it wouldn't be quick, but it was something. A line in the sand. A formal declaration that he wasn't going to let her keep pushing in the dark. Then came the dog. Lucas woke to barking, high-pitched, frantic, close. He went out with his flashlight, following the sound to the southern edge of his property. There, tangled in his fence, was a small terrier. It wasn't injured, not seriously, but it had gotten its collar stuck on the lower wire. Lucas freed it gently, checked its tag, and saw the name. Milo. Reward if found. The address was Karen's. He didn't go to her house. He didn't leave the dog at the gate. He brought it into town and handed it over at the local vet clinic who managed lost pets. When they asked if he wanted his name listed on the return slip, he shook his head. "Just let them know he's alive." The vet nodded, used to these kinds of tensions in small towns. Back home, Lucas did something he hadn't done in months. He unlocked the chest in the back of his closet, pulled out the old metal box inside, and opened it. Inside were papers, photos, a copy of his late wife's final letters, and a small black .357 revolver. oiled, legal, and never used outside the range. He checked the rounds, clicked the cylinder shut, and locked the box again. He didn't want war. He never had. But he wasn't going to be a story someone else got to write. Not now. Not ever. It was the heat that woke him, thick, motionless, clinging to the sheets like wet fabric. Lucas rolled over in the dark, squinted toward the digital clock blinking softly on the nightstand. Just past 3 a.m., the power had flickered again, briefly enough not to kill the fridge, long enough to reset everything that mattered. The room was silent. No wind, no crickets, the kind of silence that doesn't mean peace, just pause. He sat up, pulled on his jeans, and walked barefoot to the kitchen. The flashlight waited by the sink, but he didn't grab it. Instead, he opened the back door and stepped onto the porch, letting his eyes adjust to the moonlight bleeding across the grass. Something was off. He didn't need noise to tell him that. It was in the air, an absence of rhythm. Even the animals were holding their breath. Then he saw it. At the far edge of his property, where the eastern tree line met the last row of wire, a faint flicker danced. Not flame. Not quite. More like reflection. Movement. Lucas stepped back inside, pulled on his boots, and grabbed the revolver. Not drawn, not held tight, just present, heavy in his hand like a silent warning. He crossed the yard slowly, cutting through the grass until he reached the dirt trail running alongside the fence. The cam lights blinked. Motion detected. He crouched low, keeping the moon at his back, and scanned the clearing. 2 shapes. Human. They were at the fence, backs to him, crouched low near the control box that powered the lower east quadrant. One held a flashlight with a red lens. The other knelt with something metallic. Bolt cutters, maybe. They were focused, fast, methodical. Lucas didn't speak, not at first. He watched. The control box sparked once. A faint click followed. They had killed the line. He stepped forward. One more pace, then another. Stop. The word was low, not shouted, but clear. Both men froze. The one with the light turned slowly. Young, thin, face half covered by a balaclava. The second didn't move. Lucas raised the revolver slightly. Not aimed, but undeniable. Drop it. The cutter hit the dirt with a thud. The first man opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "We were told it was safe, just a recon." "By who?" Lucas asked. No answer. "You know this is private land. You know I have it on camera." The man hesitated, then stood slowly, hands visible. "We weren't told you'd be armed." Lucas almost laughed. "You thought you'd sneak into a man's property, tear apart his fence, and not get a reaction?" The second man stood now, too. He was older, stockier, silent. "Turn around," Lucas said. "Walk to the gate. Don't run. Don't talk. You make one wrong move and this won't end in paperwork." They obeyed. He walked them to the gate, revolver steady, his heart beating with a calm coldness he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not adrenaline, just the absolute clarity of a man who understood what was required. Once outside the fence, he made them sit on the gravel and radioed the sheriff's office. By the time the patrol car arrived, both men had gone pale. Deputy Fallon stepped out, hand already on her sidearm, but lowered it when she saw Lucas. She cuffed the pair without a word, asked for the tools, and took the photos he handed her, stills from the last 3 motion-activated frames on his internal cam system. One of the men broke down in the back seat of the cruiser, claimed they were hired by a client. No name, cash payment, only told to check the box and pull the current. Nothing about trespassing, nothing about Lucas. Fallon didn't comment, just closed the door and drove off with a promise to circle back in the morning. Lucas watched the taillights disappear, then turned, walked back to the fence and began resetting the system. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning brought the second wave, not from the men, not from Karen, but from her lawyer. A certified letter, hand-delivered by a courier, landed on his porch just past 10. Inside, a full lawsuit filing. Property damage, emotional distress, willful negligence, and the most absurd one, reckless endangerment of domestic animals. Milo again. The papers were padded, dramatic, but not harmless. Lucas brought them straight to Megan. She scanned them quickly, mouth pressed in a flat line. "She's trying to paint you as a vigilante," she said, "as someone who lured them in, then reacted violently." He almost laughed. "They cut my fence." "I know that, you know that, but courts don't care what feels right. They care what sticks on paper." "What's the move?" Lucas asked. "We file a countersuit," Megan replied. "We pull your reports, the cam footage, every witness statement from the sheriff. We file for harassment, malicious prosecution, and civil trespass. And we move first. Preemptive countersuit will make her case look retaliatory." Lucas nodded. "Also," she added, flipping through her files, "you need to be ready. This won't stop her. She'll spin this into a moral crusade. You embarrassed her, then outmaneuvered her. Some people don't forgive that." Lucas sat in silence for a moment, staring out the office window. Cars passed. Life moved, but his wouldn't. Not until this ended. He drove home, pulled the box of evidence from the back room and began laying everything out. Photos, timelines, surveillance, motion reports, call logs. A life dissected into paper. That night another package was left at his gate. No return address. Inside, a single item. A child's drawing, badly faded. It showed a house surrounded by black wires. In the window, a red figure with X's for eyes. The sky was full of scribbles. No note. Lucas stared at it for a long time. Then, without ceremony, he burned it in the fire barrel and went back to work reinforcing his perimeter. Because this wasn't fear anymore. This was war, and he hadn't lost one yet. The week following the break-in passed like the aftermath of a storm, not with drama, but with the heavy stillness of aftermath. The sheriff's office logged the incident formally. Charges were filed against the two intruders for criminal trespass and property interference, and Megan moved quickly, filing Lucas's countersuit with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. Karen was officially named, alongside the two men, with supporting evidence layered tight enough to drown the entire thing before it reached a courtroom. The narrative had changed. Lucas was no longer the quiet neighbor with the odd fence. He was the man whose property had become a target and who responded not with bullets or threats, but with process, with precision, and with force only when necessary. Karen didn't appear in the public after that. Her lawn remained uncut for 10 days. Her flamingos slowly tipped sideways one by one like defeated sentinels. The sign mocking Lucas disappeared one morning without fanfare, and no new ones took its place. The front windows of her house stayed dark. When a process server arrived with the paperwork for the countersuit, no one answered the door. It was taped to the glass, per regulation, and stayed there for 2 full days before disappearing. By the end of the second week, her white SUV hadn't moved. Not once. Lucas didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat or take a victory lap around the neighborhood. He simply resumed the routines she had tried so hard to disrupt. The fence was inspected and signed off on again by code enforcement, who, after seeing the footage and updated paperwork, issued a letter stating that no further investigation would be necessary. Megan framed a copy and handed it to him with a smirk, and Lucas pinned it up on the inside of his shed door, his version of a trophy. What mattered most, though, wasn't what was taken down. It was what stayed quiet. No more knocks on his gate. No more calls to animal control. No more strange objects left in the grass. The trail leading through the eastern woods slowly disappeared beneath new spring growth. The cameras blinked, but caught only deer and the occasional raccoon now. Milo, the little dog, hadn't been seen since the clinic called to confirm he'd been picked up by a family friend. Lucas hadn't asked who. It didn't matter. The legal proceedings would take months, possibly longer, but the message had been sent. Lucas had drawn a line in the dirt and defended it, not just with wire and steel, but with preparation, with records, with calm in the face of harassment. He hadn't outmuscled his opponent. He'd outlasted her. And the neighborhood noticed. It started small. The man 2 properties down waved one morning when Lucas was hauling lumber to the back shed. A week later, a retired couple from up the road stopped their walk to comment on how well the perimeter looked, how smart it was to be proactive these days with how people are. Even the clerk at the feed store, a quiet kid who usually barely grunted, asked Lucas how to set up a battery-backed alert system. None of them said Karen's name. They didn't have to. What they said with their eyes, their tone, was clearer than gossip. You were right to fight. And we were watching. Lucas didn't become popular. He didn't start showing up to potlucks or join local committees, but the hostility that had once clung to his fence like ivy now rolled off it like water. People understood what he was now. A man who didn't seek conflict, but didn't yield either. Spring passed into early summer, and one afternoon a moving truck pulled into Karen's drive. 2 men loaded furniture into the back without hurry. No one stood outside directing them. No goodbyes. Just boxes, wrapped couches, a treadmill that looked unused. Lucas watched from the porch, not hiding, not staring, just observing. No one came to the fence. No one waved. By dusk, the truck was gone and Karen's house was empty. Quiet, curtains drawn. 2 weeks later, a "for sale" sign appeared at the edge of her lawn. Lucas didn't ask who was moving in. He didn't attend the open house, but he did drive into town and stop at the county office. He updated his land filing, added formal language about his fence line, and submitted copies of the full survey with declarations of boundary acknowledgement. Nothing dramatic, just locking it in, on paper, where no whispers could undo it. That night, he walked the perimeter one last time before bed. The air was calm, the sky deep and clear. At the far side of the fence, he paused, hands resting on the top wire, eyes scanning the woods that had once hidden strangers. Nothing moved, just trees. The good kind of silence. He looked down. Near the base of the post was a small rust spot. Faint, almost shaped like a handprint. The metal rake incident. All those weeks ago. It hadn't fully faded. Lucas didn't scrub it clean. He let it be, not as a scar, but as a reminder. Some people test fences, some people cross them, and some learn, painfully, that every man has his voltage,